When I first met Evelyn Parker, my mother-in-law, she looked me up and down like I was gum stuck to her designer heels. Her voice was sharp and cold. She said, "So you're the girl Daniel's wasting his time on?" I smiled politely to hide how much those words burned. I remembered them every night. I told myself I would not break. I promised I would make her regret saying them. Daniel squeezed my hand when we left his parents' mansion that night. He said, "She'll warm up to you." But his smile was small and his eyes worried. Evelyn never warmed to anyone she could not control. She came from old money. Her husband, Richard, owned half the real estate in Seattle. I came from nowhere, a small town, a single mom, and a waitress job through college. To her, I was a charity case who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Daniel loved me, and that mattered more than her opinion. We married quietly with only a few friends. Evelyn did not come. She sent a card instead. I opened it with my hands that shook. The card said, "Don't expect handouts. Marrying into this family doesn't make you one of us." That was the first time I knew she hated me. The first months after we married were calm. Daniel and I rented a small apartment downtown. He worked at his father's company. I opened a tiny floral shop because flowers made me breathe. Business was slow and I worried, but the shop belonged to me. Evelyn never visited. She wrote invitations to charity and country clubs and left me out. When she finally met me again at a family dinner, she tasted me like a bad flavor and smiled a smile that cut. I learned quickly how cruel she could be. I learned how closely she watched. I learned that to survive I would have to be stronger than silence. Evelyn started small and she got worse like weeds that choke a garden. She never came to my shop, but she showed up at our apartment without warning and criticized everything. She said my soup needed class, my clothes were common, and my shop looked like a hobby. Once, she walked through my storefront and waved at the flowers like they were cheap toys. "Cute," she said. "Feels like a hobby for someone without real ambition." Her words landed like stones. Daniel tried to defend me at first with quiet lines. He said, "She wants what's best for us." He believed his mother loved him and wanted him safe. But her idea of safe meant keeping him inside a life built by money and names. She whispered poison into his ear slowly until he feared losing the life she had planned. My worry grew in the weeks that followed. Strange things began to happen at the flower shop. A supplier cancelled an order at the last minute. A potential client never showed up. My business loan was recalled with confusing reasons that felt like a door closing in my face. My landlord told me someone had offered him double my rent and he wanted to consider it. I did not have to guess who had the reach to do such things. When I confronted Evelyn at a family function, she smiled a sweet, slow smile that did not touch her eyes. She said, "Life isn't as easy as you think. People like us have to protect what we've built from opportunists." Daniel looked at me confused and I kept silent. I could feel her watching me like a hawk in a tree. I felt small and angry. I knew then that if I wanted peace, I would have to make it for myself. I began to pay attention to everything. Names, dates, the way she left the table early, who answered her phone. I started to learn how heavy the world of Evelyn Parker could be. I learned that power hides in small, quiet moves. The wedge Evelyn built between Daniel and me widened like a crack in glass. She began to show Daniel a future that did not need me. She called him with concerns and gentle warnings. She said things like, "You could have anyone, sweetheart. Someone educated. Someone who understands your world." She said it slow as if telling him a secret that would save him. I started to hear the edges of her words late at night when doors clicked and footsteps echoed. I would stand outside their closed bedroom door and listen, but I could not make the argument loud enough to break through the quiet. Daniel became distant without meaning to. He brushed off my questions and blamed work stress. I blamed myself and tried to be better. I worked more hours at the shop, arranged more deliveries, and stayed up late to plan sales. I thought if I only proved my worth, the crack would heal. But one night I found a strange number on Daniel's phone and a message said, "Dinner tomorrow? Mom says she'll join us." When I asked, he said it was a work contact and I let it go like a fragile thing. That was mistake number one. Spring came and Evelyn invited Daniel to stay at the house while she recovered from a minor surgery. He packed a small suitcase and kissed my forehead and said, "It's just until she's better." He left with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Weeks turned into months and I watched the bed stay cold. The couch held his coat. The kitchen kept a cup he never drank from. He did not come back for 2 months. When he finally returned, his voice had a new chill. He said, "Mom thinks you're not happy here. Maybe you should stay with your mom for a while." It was not a suggestion. It was an order softened with concern. I packed my things and went to my mother's small house in Tacoma with hands that could not stop shaking. I think I cried for 3 days. I thought the marriage was over. But my mother said something that changed me. She said, "Baby, don't let her win. She's playing chess. Time to learn the game." I took those words like armor. I stopped crying and I started planning. I began to study Evelyn like a class I needed to pass. I learned about her charities, her real estate, her gift names and board memberships. I read public records until my eyes tired. I made lists of her patterns. I learned details about the people who worked for her and the charities she used as a stage. Information felt like light in a dark room. I found small slips and strange entries in papers that did not match. I tasted the idea that she might not be careful with everything she owned. I watched how her assistant, Marcy, moved and how she talked about Evelyn when she thought no one listened. Marcy once came to my shop for flowers after a board meeting. She told me private things without meaning to. She said Evelyn had a harsh temper, the kind that scared people into silence. She mentioned late nights at the office and headaches and small mistakes that were smoothed over. I noticed how Marcy trusted me quickly, and I learned to be gentle with that trust. I did not push. I gave her flowers and listened. When she let slip about donor reports and paperwork, I held my breath. Over time, Marcy slipped me copies of donor pages with numbers that did not fit. I studied them at my kitchen table under a small lamp. I saw fake signatures and mismatched amounts. There was an account number tied to an offshore fund that did not belong to the charity. My hands trembled when I realized what I found. It meant Evelyn had not only been cruel and controlling, but careless and illegal. I thought about the risk. I thought about Daniel and how his mother moved like a fog that seeped into everything. I also thought about my shop, my life, and how she had taken pieces of them. I decided to keep the discovery secret. I needed proof and I needed time. I began to collect more copies and to back up everything on a drive I hid in a book on my shelf. The quiet no longer looked like defeat. It looked like a plan. I called Daniel that night and kept my voice steady. He said, "Mom says you're obsessed with money lately." I listened and I did not rise to his words. I said, "Tell your mother she will wish she never met me." Then I hung up and felt my heart beat hard against my ribs. I waited 2 months and I worked slowly like a spider weaving a web. Evelyn thought I was broken and forgotten. She forgot I had learned to be patient. She forgot I had learned about ledgers and donors and secrets. I waited until the annual charity gala she hosted in the summer, the night all of Seattle's elite would gather under chandeliers and polite smiles. I went even though I was not invited. I dressed in a simple black dress that hugged my confidence. Eyes turned when I walked in. Conversations paused and a hush rolled in short waves. Evelyn froze when she saw me. Her mouth opened like a snare. She said, "Lila, you were not on the guest list." Her voice tried to be sweet and legal. I smiled and held a sealed envelope. I handed it to her and said, "Open it later. You'll want privacy." It felt good to walk away with the envelope heavy in her hands like a secret bomb. That night at 11:43 p.m., her call came. Her voice was small and shaking, and I felt a new power tighten in my chest. She asked, Where did you get these documents? I said, does it matter? They are real. Unless you want the board or the police to see them, you will do exactly what I say. She whispered, blackmail. I answered, no, justice. For the next month she became quiet. She did not visit or call or throw cold glances. Daniel noticed the change, and he did not ask. He fixed what had been broken at work and at home, and I played along so he would not worry. I watched as Evelyn's world narrowed, and I kept my face calm. I made no threats that could not be proven. I wanted her to be the one who chose how to make it right. Then, on September 4th, after a long summer, she came to my shop after closing. Her makeup was streaked and her hands shook, and she asked me on her knees for help. I locked the door behind her, and I looked at the woman who had tried to ruin me. I felt things I did not expect to feel. I was tired, and I was not sure how much mercy I owed her. I stood and listened to her words. Evelyn sat on the floor of my flower shop, her knees pressing into the tile, her eyes red and trembling. For the first time, she looked small. Please, she whispered, we can make a deal. Her voice shook, but I said nothing. I watched her like someone studying a stranger. She had destroyed my business once, torn my marriage apart, and laughed while doing it. Now she wanted mercy. Why should I help you? I asked. Because if this gets out, I'll lose everything, she said. The house, the company, my foundation. Richard will never forgive me. She tried to pull herself together, but her pride cracked through every breath. I crossed my arms. Good, I said quietly. She blinked at me, shocked. Then her voice broke. What do you want? I looked her straight in the eye. An apology, I said. Not just words, real ones. I want you to mean it. Her face twisted in disbelief. You can't be serious. I'm serious, I said. You once told me I'd never be good enough for your son. Prove me wrong. For a long moment, she said nothing. I thought she might storm out, but instead she slid down again, her manicured hands trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. Please, don't ruin me. I didn't smile. I wanted her to understand this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. You're lucky I'm not like you, I said. I won't destroy you, but you'll make things right. She nodded through tears, and I believed her for the first time. That night, I closed the shop and sat in silence, staring at the flowers around me. Everything smelled of lavender and truth. I had taken back my power without breaking the law, without lying. It felt clean. I didn't sleep, but I didn't need to. Justice didn't need rest. The next morning, Evelyn called her lawyers. By afternoon, every missing dollar had been wired back into her charity's accounts. It was like watching a storm retreat. A week later, the press announced a new initiative, the Lila Grace Foundation, a fund to help women-owned small businesses across Washington. Evelyn stood at a podium, cameras flashing, pretending she'd created it from compassion. But when she thanked me publicly, I saw something honest in her eyes. Fear. My daughter-in-law, Lila Grace, inspired this project, she said into the microphone, voice soft and careful. The crowd clapped, and I smiled from the back of the room. No one knew the real story. They saw a gracious woman making amends. I saw a desperate one paying her debts. Daniel noticed, too. That evening, he came home pale, holding the newspaper. Mom told me everything, he said. I braced for anger, for judgment, for the end. But instead, he whispered, "Thank you." The words caught me off guard. He knew his mother had been wrong. We didn't talk about the details, but that night, he held me like someone who had finally seen the truth. Our marriage wasn't magically fixed, but something inside it healed. Evelyn stayed quiet. She didn't visit, didn't call. I half expected her to strike again, but she didn't. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she'd learned that I wasn't easy prey anymore. Months passed. My shop began to bloom again, literally and figuratively. New customers came, new suppliers trusted me, and the air felt lighter. Sometimes I wondered if I'd gone too far. But then I'd remember her words, never good enough, and I knew I hadn't. Some lessons needed to be carved into memory. When power is stolen from you, taking it back isn't cruelty. It's survival. I slept soundly for the first time in a long time, surrounded by flowers that didn't wither under anyone's shadow. Peace became my new addiction. I guarded it like gold. Daniel and I rebuilt our lives one quiet evening at a time. Shared dinners, morning coffee, small laughter. He started visiting my shop after work again, buying roses for a client, just to see me smile. Evelyn's silence stretched into months, then seasons. Still, I kept the evidence locked away, every document, every email, hidden in a safe behind the counter, just in case. I never planned to use it again, but knowing it existed made me feel safe. Control, I learned, wasn't about power, it was about choice. One afternoon in early spring, I received an invitation addressed in perfect calligraphy. It was for Evelyn's upcoming charity gala, the first since the scandal she'd nearly caused. I didn't want to go. But Daniel asked gently, maybe it's time to move forward. I saw hope in his eyes. So I agreed. The night of the gala, Evelyn approached us with a champagne smile. She wore her usual pearls and control. "Lila," she said, "you look lovely." For once, there was no insult hiding beneath her tone. I thanked her, but inside, I stayed ready. She might have apologized, but I'd learned she never lost the habit of scheming. That night, she introduced me to donors, complimented my business, even asked about my mother. It all seemed sincere, too sincere. On the drive home, Daniel said, "Maybe she's changed." I wanted to believe him, but I'd spent too many nights learning the rhythm of lies. Change wasn't a word Evelyn Parker understood. It was a performance she perfected. Still, I smiled and said, "Maybe." Because sometimes pretending peace is the only way to keep it. I didn't know then that Evelyn's story wasn't over. Some debts, even when paid, still echo. And hers was a voice that refused to stay silent for long. It started with a rumor. A friend from downtown whispered that Evelyn's name had been removed from one of her own foundations. Something about internal disputes, she said. I acted surprised. But I knew what it meant. Someone inside had found traces of what I'd found months earlier. Evelyn had covered her tracks, but maybe not perfectly. I felt a flicker of guilt, wondering if I should warn her. Then I remembered her sneer when she ruined my shop and the nights she made me doubt my worth. I stayed silent. Still, the fallout came quickly. Evelyn withdrew from public events. Her husband, Richard, began attending alone. The gossip pages called it a temporary illness. I called it consequence. One evening, Daniel came home quiet, eyes tired. "Mom wants to see you," he said. My pulse skipped. "Why?" He shrugged. "She said she owes you an explanation." I didn't want to go, but curiosity won. When I arrived at her mansion, she waited by the window, smaller somehow, wrapped in a shawl. "You warned me," she said softly. "And I didn't listen." I nodded, unsure what to say. "They found irregularities in my old accounts," she continued. "I fixed what I could, but reputation dies faster than truth." I stayed silent. She sighed, looking older than I'd ever seen her. "You destroyed me without lifting a finger," she said. "No," I corrected. "You destroyed yourself." For the first time, she didn't argue. We sat there, two women bound by pride and pain, and the air between us softened. When I left that night, she didn't follow. I thought that was the last time I'd see her. But I was wrong. Life rarely closes a door without leaving it slightly ajar. A year passed before I saw Evelyn again. It was at a charity dinner, ironically, one organized by the Lila Grace Foundation. She entered quietly, no entourage, no expensive jewelry, just a plain black dress. When she spotted me, our eyes met across the room. She smiled, small, tired, real. After the event, I found an envelope tucked into my purse. Inside was a handwritten letter. Just 3 sentences. You were right. I was cruel because I was afraid of losing him. But I lost him anyway. I hope you can forgive me. I read it 3 times, then folded it back carefully. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give easily. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace. I kept the letter in the same safe that once held her crimes. It reminded me that even the strongest enemies bleed human. Sometimes when I watered the flowers at my shop, I'd think of her. Of the woman who once called me a nobody and then knelt on my floor begging for mercy. People came in, buying flowers for love or sorrow, never guessing that my shop had been a battlefield once. I smiled at that thought. Life had come full circle. Evelyn lived quietly now, away from the spotlight. Daniel visited her sometimes, but he never stayed long. We didn't talk about her much. Some stories didn't need retelling, they just needed to rest. Still, every time I saw her name in the paper, I remembered her first words to me, "You'll never be good enough." And I smiled, because she'd been wrong. I wasn't just good enough, I was the only one strong enough to make her kneel, to make her beg, to make her see me. And that was enough. Peace didn't mean forgetting. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before opening the shop, I'd think about how close I came to losing everything. Daniel, my business, even myself. But what haunted me most wasn't Evelyn's cruelty. It was how easily she'd almost won. I realized that people like her didn't fight with fists. They fought with whispers, influence, and fear. And I had learned their language. One morning, Daniel came in holding 2 coffees. He looked softer now, lighter, as if the weight of his mother's shadow had lifted. "You seem happier," he said. I nodded. "I am." He smiled and said, "I like this version of us." I did too. We talked about expanding the shop, maybe opening another location near the university. For the first time, our dreams weren't being measured by Evelyn's approval. Still, there were moments when I'd catch Daniel staring at his phone, waiting for a message that didn't come. I knew he still loved his mother, and part of me respected that. Family love doesn't vanish, no matter how broken it becomes. When her birthday came around, Daniel asked if I'd sign a card. I did. It felt strange, but it was a small gesture of peace. A week later, a box arrived at the shop. Inside was a set of gardening shears with my initials engraved on the handle. The note said, "For new beginnings, E." I stared at it for a long time. Maybe she meant it as an apology, or maybe it was another test. I decided to take it as peace. I hung the shears by the counter and used them every day. The blades gleamed under the sunlight, sharp and clean. Sometimes, I caught my reflection in them, a reminder of who I'd become. Not a victim. Not a girl begging for acceptance. A woman who had learned that survival was its own kind of victory. And forgiveness, when chosen freely, was power. Months passed, and business bloomed. My shop became known for bright, unique arrangements. Sunflowers mixed with wild lavender, roses paired with eucalyptus. I hired 2 part-time assistants, and for the first time, I didn't worry about bills. Life finally felt stable. Then one chilly morning, Daniel came home later than usual. He looked distracted, running a hand through his hair. "Mom's not well," he said. My heart tightened. "What happened?" "Stress, mostly," he said. "The last year took a lot out of her." I didn't know what to feel, pity, anger, or relief. She had built her empire on control. Losing it must have felt like losing air. Daniel asked if I'd visit her. I hesitated but agreed. When I arrived, the mansion felt emptier than before. No maids, no music, just quiet. Evelyn sat by the window, thinner, wrapped in a pale shawl. "Lila," she said softly, "I didn't expect you. Daniel asked me to come." She nodded. "He's always been kind. I don't deserve him." Her voice carried a sadness that didn't sound rehearsed. "You've changed," I said before I could stop myself. She gave a faint smile. Losing everything does that. We talked for a while about nothing. Weather, flowers, even recipes. But beneath it all was something heavier, unspoken. As I stood to leave, she said, "Thank you for not destroying me." I paused, unsure what to say. She looked at me with eyes that were no longer sharp, just tired. "You did what I would have done," she whispered. "But you did it better." I left without answering. The air outside was cold, crisp with late autumn. I realized something then. Revenge had ended long ago, but the lesson hadn't. Power wasn't in making her kneel. It was in standing tall after she tried to break me. That night, I watered my flowers and watched them shimmer in moonlight. They grew, stubborn and bright, just like me. Evelyn's health improved slowly, and Daniel began visiting her once a week. Sometimes he'd bring her meals or read to her from his favorite novels. I stayed out of it. I'd made peace, but I didn't need to play daughter-in-law again. Still, one day he asked me to come along. "She's different now," he said. Against my instincts, I went. Evelyn greeted me with a soft smile. "Lila," she said, "you're looking well." Her voice lacked the icy tone I remembered. She poured tea for both of us, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you still have your shop?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's doing well." "Good. You always were talented." The compliment caught me off guard. We spoke for nearly an hour, and she didn't insult me once. I left that day unsettled, not by her words, but by how sincere they seemed. On the drive home, Daniel said, "I think she finally sees you." I stared out the window, watching the city blur by. "Maybe," I said. But part of me wondered if people like Evelyn truly changed, or if they just learned how to hide sharper edges. A week later, she sent a donation to the Lila Grace Foundation under my name. When the bank confirmed it, I felt a strange mixture of pride and caution. Maybe it was her way of saying thank you. Or maybe it was guilt. Either way, it meant the war between us was truly over. That night, Daniel and I sat on the couch, the TV flickering quietly. He rested his head on my shoulder and said, "You saved us." I thought about that for a long time. Maybe I had. But saving something doesn't mean it goes back to how it was. It becomes something new, scarred, but stronger. And maybe that was enough. Winter came, cold and slow. My shop was filled with poinsettias and evergreen wreaths. Business thrived, but inside, I felt restless. I kept thinking about Evelyn's words. "You did what I would have done." It echoed in my mind like a warning. One snowy evening, I stayed late arranging flowers for a wedding order. As I worked, the doorbell rang. I frowned. My shop had closed an hour ago. When I opened the door, Evelyn stood there, bundled in a thick coat. "It's freezing," I said, startled. "You shouldn't be out." She smiled faintly. "I needed to see you." I led her inside, offering tea. She looked around the shop like she was seeing it for the first time. "You built this yourself," she murmured. "Every petal, every corner." "Yes," I said carefully. "Without your help." She nodded. "I know. That's what makes it beautiful." Her voice trembled slightly. "I wanted to tell you something before it's too late." My heart tightened. "What do you mean?" She took a breath. "I'm selling the mansion. I'm moving into a smaller house near the coast. I need peace." For a moment, I just stared at her. The queen of control, surrendering her throne. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because," she said quietly, "you taught me what matters. I can't fix everything I broke, but I can start again." Her eyes glistened. "And I wanted you to know, I'm proud of Daniel for loving you." That last part hit harder than I expected. I didn't cry, but something inside me softened. When she left, snowflakes drifted into the doorway. I watched her car disappear down the road and realized that sometimes, victory isn't loud. Sometimes, it's watching the person who once hated you find their own way to peace. Spring came again, soft and forgiving. The Lila Grace Foundation had helped dozens of women open small shops across Seattle. Every time I saw a new flower store or bakery run by a woman smiling with pride, I thought of how far I'd come. One morning, Daniel brought me breakfast in bed and said, "Mom wants to host one last event before she moves. She asked if you'd come." I hesitated. What kind of event? "A fundraiser, for women in business. She said it's your legacy as much as hers." I agreed. When the night came, the hall was decorated with lilies and soft lights. Evelyn stood at the center, graceful but quieter than I'd ever seen her. She spotted me and walked over slowly. "Lila," she said, "thank you for coming." I nodded. "You look happy." She smiled. "I am." When she took the stage to speak, her voice didn't tremble. She talked about growth, forgiveness, and learning humility. "Sometimes," she said, "the people we try hardest to break are the ones who teach us how to rebuild." Her eyes found mine in the crowd. For a second, I saw something like love there. After the applause, she approached me again. "Goodbye, Lila," she said softly. "Take care of Daniel." "I will," I promised. And then she added, "You were always good enough. I just wasn't brave enough to see it." That night, as I stood under the lights, I felt the last weight lift from my chest. The story that began with her cruelty ended with her respect. When Daniel and I left hand in hand, I looked back at the fading hall and whispered to myself, "Justice served. Peace earned." My life had been built from ashes, but now it bloomed like a field of wildflowers, free, bright, and alive. Evelyn moved to her coastal home that summer. The papers called it early retirement, but I knew it was something deeper, an act of surrender. Daniel and I visited once, just before she left. The mansion was half empty, the walls bare, like a person shedding old skin. "It feels strange seeing it like this," Daniel said. Evelyn walked with us through the quiet halls, pausing by family portraits she hadn't taken down yet. She touched Daniel's face in one photo, smiling faintly. "He was such a happy boy," she whispered. For once, I heard no bitterness in her tone, only nostalgia. Before we left, she handed me a small box. "For you," she said. Inside was a locket with a pressed white rose sealed inside glass. "It's from my wedding bouquet," she said softly. "I kept it all these years. I think you'll take better care of it than I did." I didn't know how to respond. The gesture felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter. That night, as we drove home, Daniel reached for my hand. "She's really changed," he said. I nodded but didn't speak. Change wasn't something I trusted easily. Still, when I looked at the locket resting on my lap, I felt something shift. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. Weeks later, a letter arrived postmarked from her new address. It said simply, "The ocean is quiet here. I think I finally understand peace." I placed it in the safe beside her old apology letter. Together, they told the story of two women who had once been enemies, both learning that power meant nothing without grace. That night, as I watered the flowers in my shop, I whispered to myself, "We both survived her war." Time softened everything. Daniel and I built a steadier rhythm, work, laughter, dinners with friends. My business expanded to a second location, and the foundation grew beyond Seattle. Reporters came, writing stories about the florist who changed the city. I smiled through interviews but kept my private history buried. The truth was too sharp for public eyes. One afternoon, I got a call from Evelyn. It had been months since her move. "How are you?" I asked, surprised. "Lonely," she admitted. "But it's the kind of loneliness I chose." We spoke for nearly an hour about books, about flowers, even about Daniel's childhood. It was the easiest conversation we'd ever had. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time since I'd known her. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected, compassion. That night, Daniel found me smiling at my phone. "Who was it?" he asked. "Your mother," I said. He raised his eyebrows. And she's learning to be human, I said softly. Daniel chuckled, kissed my forehead and said, that's progress. Months passed like that. Gentle, unremarkable days. Occasionally, Evelyn sent photos of her garden by the sea. Rows of white lilies, pale tulips, and daisies, her own kind of healing. She'd write, now I understand why you love flowers. They forgive the cold every spring. Those words stayed with me. Maybe we weren't enemies anymore, just two women who'd finally stopped fighting ghosts. When I visited her that autumn, the sea air smelled clean and endless. She served tea on the porch and said, do you ever miss the fight? I shook my head. No. Winning was enough. She smiled at that. It's strange, she said, how peace feels heavier than revenge. I understood exactly what she meant. The years passed quietly, and Daniel and I grew into our happiness. We never had children, but we built a life filled with color, flowers, travel, laughter. Every holiday, we'd send Evelyn a box from my shop. Fresh blooms, always white roses. She'd call, her voice softer each year. One summer, she invited us to stay for a weekend. Her cottage was small but bright, filled with sunlight and salt air. It's not much, she said modestly. But it's mine. I smiled. That's all that matters. We spent the weekend cooking, walking along the beach, and reminiscing. Daniel looked happy, boyish again. On our last morning, I found Evelyn in the garden, hands deep in the soil. I thought you didn't like dirt, I teased. She laughed. Maybe I needed to touch the earth to understand you. She looked up at me, eyes kind. I used to think strength meant control. But you showed me it's the opposite. Her words hit me deep. I knelt beside her, feeling the cool earth between my fingers. You weren't wrong about wanting strength, I said. You just didn't know how to use it. She nodded slowly. I do now. When we left, she hugged me. Really hugged me. No pretense, no competition. Just warmth. Driving away, Daniel said, I never thought I'd see that day. I looked at the sea fading behind us and said, neither did I. That night, I realized forgiveness had snuck up on me. It wasn't loud or sudden. It just quietly replaced the bitterness I'd carried for years. For the first time, I wasn't holding on to pain. I was holding peace. Evelyn's hair turned silver, her hands slower. She called less often, but each time, she sounded lighter, freer. I could tell she'd found her rhythm by the ocean. Quiet mornings, books, tea, her garden. Then one spring evening, Daniel came home with wet eyes. I knew before he spoke. She's gone, he said, peacefully. In her sleep. My breath caught, and I sat down hard. Grief came strangely, not sharp, but hollow, like missing something you never thought you'd care for. We drove to the coast the next morning. Her house smelled like salt and flowers. On her kitchen table sat an envelope with my name. Inside, she'd written, thank you for teaching me strength. For showing me mercy when I gave you none. I hope the flowers always bloom for you, Lila. I cried for her. Quiet, honest tears. Daniel held me close. She loved you, he whispered. Maybe she finally did, I said. We buried her near the garden she'd built, beneath the white lilies she adored. The ocean wind hummed through the air, soft and endless. As we left, I looked back and whispered, goodbye, Evelyn. You were wrong about me. But you learned. That night, I sat in my shop surrounded by flowers and silence. I realized that the woman who once tried to break me had also shaped me. Every scar she gave me became part of my armor. Every cruel word had taught me how to stand. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It rewrote it. And Evelyn's final lesson was simple. Peace isn't something you're given. It's something you earn. Life after Evelyn felt different. Quieter, but not empty. Daniel and I kept her garden alive by the sea. Every spring, we visited, planting fresh white roses. One day, as I knelt in the soil, Daniel said, "She'd be proud of you." I smiled softly. Maybe she already was. The wind carried the scent of salt and roses, mingling with memories. I thought about the girl I'd been when I first met Evelyn, the timid florist with dirt under her nails. She'd been right about one thing. I wasn't born into their world, but I'd built my own. Stronger. Kinder. Mine. My shop grew into a small chain, and the foundation spread nationwide. People called me an inspiration, but I never told them where the fire came from. It came from being told I'd never be enough, and proving otherwise. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I took the locket Evelyn had given me and pressed it into the earth beside her garden. "Thank you," I whispered, "for the lesson." Then I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and watched the tide roll in. The world was quiet, gentle, forgiving. The story had started with her cruelty, but it ended with her peace, and my freedom. Now, when I walked through my shop, I saw her shadow not as an enemy's mark but as proof that I survived a storm. I smiled at the thought. She had once said I'd never be good enough. But in the end, I had been the only one strong enough to make her kneel, and kind enough to let her rise again. After Evelyn's passing, I found myself thinking about legacy. Not wealth or property, but what we leave behind in people. Evelyn had left me pain, yes, but she had also left me purpose. Without her cruelty, I might never have learned my strength. The Lila Grace Foundation flourished that year. We funded over 100 new women-owned businesses across the country. Each time I met one of those women, nervous, hopeful, brave, I saw pieces of my younger self in them. I told them the same thing my mother once told me: don't let anyone write your story for you. Daniel stood by my side through it all. Our love had changed. It was quieter now, more like the steady hum of something tested and proven. One evening, as we walked along the beach near Evelyn's old house, Daniel said, "She'd be happy to see what you've done." I nodded, the sea breeze lifting my hair. "Maybe she sees it," I said softly. "Maybe she's finally proud." He smiled and slipped his arm around me. For the first time, the word mother-in-law didn't sting. It carried weight, but not pain. The sunset turned the waves gold, and I thought about forgiveness again. It was strange how something that once felt impossible could become second nature. I had spent so long fighting Evelyn's shadow, I hadn't noticed when the light finally returned. That night, back at home, I opened her last letter again. Her words still hurt, but they also healed. I whispered to the paper, "I forgive you." And in that moment, I realized I had also forgiven myself, for doubting my worth, for believing her lies. Sometimes, peace isn't about letting go of others. It's about freeing yourself from the chains they left behind. Years rolled forward like gentle waves. Daniel and I celebrated our 10th anniversary quietly. No grand gestures, just dinner, laughter, and memories. My business had grown into a chain of floral shops across the Pacific Northwest. People began calling me the Flower Queen of Seattle, a title that once would have made me laugh. But I accepted it with grace. Every shop had a framed quote near the counter, "Bloom through what you go through." It became our motto. One afternoon, a young woman named Harper came in for an interview. She was shy, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm not sure I'm good enough," she said. The words hit me hard. I smiled gently. "Neither was I said, until someone told me I wasn't, and I proved them wrong." She looked at me like I'd handed her a secret map. That night, as I locked up, I thought about Evelyn again. Her voice still echoed in my memory, but it no longer sounded cruel. It sounded like a challenge I'd conquered. Daniel came by with takeout, his tie loose, his grin boyish. "Remember when we used to dream about this?" he said, gesturing to the glowing storefront. "I remember when it felt impossible," I replied. We ate surrounded by flowers and laughter, and I realized how far I'd come. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, and that was more than enough. Before bed, I looked out at the moonlit city and whispered, "I did it, Evelyn." Maybe the wind carried the words to her. Maybe not. But for the first time, I didn't need her to hear them. I already knew who I was. The following spring brought something unexpected. A letter from a journalist writing a book about Seattle's influential women. She wanted to include a chapter about the Lila Grace Foundation. I agreed, but I asked for one condition, that the story focus on the women we helped, not me. When she arrived for the interview, she asked, "Where did this idea come from?" I smiled, remembering Evelyn's trembling voice that night in my flower shop, her knees on the cold tile. "It came from a woman who once underestimated me," I said simply. "She taught me what power really is." The journalist looked intrigued. "And what is power?" "Kindness with a spine," I answered. After the article was published, people began sending letters. Women from across the country thanking me for inspiring them to start over, to fight back, to believe in their worth. I read every single one. Each story reminded me that strength wasn't about revenge or dominance. It was about transformation. Daniel framed the article and hung it in our living room. "You should be proud," he said. "You turned pain into something beautiful." I traced my fingers over the framed glass and whispered, "She helped in her own way." Daniel chuckled. "You're still giving her credit?" "Maybe that's the final mercy," I said. The next morning, I visited her garden again. The white roses were in full bloom. I placed a single sunflower beside them, a symbol of light and resilience. Standing there, I realized something profound. Even enemies can leave blessings behind, if you're strong enough to look for them. By the time another decade passed, I had everything I once dreamed of, a thriving business, a happy marriage, and peace that felt real. Still, every success brought me back to the same lesson. Strength grows from struggle. I often spoke at women's conferences now, telling my story without names. I'd say, "There was a woman who told me I'd never be good enough. I proved her wrong, not by hurting her, but by healing myself." The audience always went silent, listening like they were hearing a secret truth. After one event, a young mother came up to me in tears. "My husband's family treats me like I don't belong," she said. "How did you stand it?" I placed a hand on her shoulder. "By remembering that belonging starts with you," I said softly. "You don't need their approval to have worth." She smiled through tears, and I saw myself in her eyes. That night, I came home to Daniel cooking dinner. "How was it?" he asked. "Powerful," I said. "Every time I tell that story, it feels lighter." He smiled knowingly. "That's how healing works. It echoes." Later, I sat on our porch, looking at the stars, thinking of Evelyn again. Somewhere in that vast quiet, I hoped she knew that her lesson hadn't been wasted. She had taught me that cruelty could be fuel if you burned it into strength. Maybe that was her redemption. Maybe that was mine too. I closed my eyes, feeling grateful, not for what she'd done, but for what I became because of it. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a charity gala, the same event Evelyn once hosted years ago. The irony made me smile. The organizers wanted to honor her legacy as the original founder of the Parker Foundation. I accepted, knowing it felt right to close the circle. The hall shimmered with chandeliers and laughter, much like it had the night I walked in uninvited all those years ago. But this time, I was the guest of honor. When they called my name, I stood at the same podium Evelyn had once claimed as her throne. I took a deep breath and began. Years ago, I stood in this room as someone invisible. Tonight, I stand here because one woman's cruelty taught me resilience, and her fear taught me courage. This foundation began with her, and grew because she changed. The crowd listened in silence. I looked toward the empty front row seat, the one that should have been hers. "Forgiveness," I continued, "isn't about excusing the pain. It's about choosing to stop carrying it." The audience rose in applause, but I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace. Afterward, Daniel wrapped his arm around me. "She'd be proud," he whispered. I smiled through quiet tears. "She finally got what she wanted," I said softly. "Her name remembered, with grace." That night, as we walked out into the cool air, I realized that stories like ours don't end. They bloom again and again, each time softer, each time kinder. And I knew the girl Evelyn once called Never Good Enough had finally become everything she was meant to be. After the gala, life slowed into something calm and golden. I woke early each morning, opened the shop, and watched sunlight filter through rows of petals. My assistants teased that I hummed when I worked now, something I never noticed before. Maybe peace makes you hum. The Lila Grace Foundation continued to grow, and I began mentoring young women one-on-one. They reminded me of myself, scared but brave enough to try anyway. One of them, a bright-eyed artist named Naomi, said, "You talk about forgiveness like it's easy." I smiled. "It isn't," I said. "But it's lighter than hate." She nodded slowly, understanding more than she could put into words. That evening, Daniel and I went to dinner to celebrate 15 years of marriage. Over candlelight, he said, "Do you ever think about how it all started?" I laughed softly. "Every day." He reached across the table, took my hand, and whispered, "I'm sorry for not seeing what she was doing sooner." My chest tightened, but I smiled. "You saw it when it mattered." He nodded, his eyes soft with guilt and gratitude. As we walked home, hand in hand, I realized how different love feels when it's weathered storms. It's quieter, stronger, and real. That night, I looked at Evelyn's old locket on my nightstand. The pressed white rose inside had faded to ivory, but it was still beautiful. It reminded me that even something fragile could last if treated with care. I whispered, "We did it, Evelyn." The house was still, and yet, for a moment, it felt like she heard me. The next few years brought both joy and loss. My mother passed away peacefully one summer morning. She had always been my quiet strength, the voice that told me not to let Evelyn win. At her funeral, I placed a single lily on her coffin and whispered, "I learned the game, Mama, and I won it with grace." The grief hit me harder than I expected. For weeks, I wandered through my shop like a ghost. Daniel stayed close, patient and steady. "She'd want you to keep going," he said gently. One afternoon, I opened the safe where I kept Evelyn's and my mother's letters. I read them both, side by side. My mother's words were full of fire, Evelyn's full of regret. Two women who shaped me, one through love, the other through challenge. Together, they had built the woman I had become. I realized then that strength isn't born from one kind of pain. It's layered, like petals protecting the heart of a flower. So, I started something new. In my mother's memory, I launched a mentorship program called the Grace Circle, a place where women could support one another through hardship. We met once a month in the back of my shop. We drank tea, told stories, and healed together. It was small, but it mattered. And every time I saw a woman walk out taller than when she came in, I thought of my mother and Evelyn. They were opposites, yet both had taught me the same truth. We rise when we're seen, and sometimes, even enemies can be teachers in disguise. As the Grace Circle grew, so did its reach. We started inviting guest speakers, women who had faced betrayal, loss, or failure but found strength anyway. The sessions filled quickly, and soon I had to rent a larger space. During one meeting, a young woman stood and said, "Your story saved my life." I didn't know what to say. I had shared it once briefly, about a woman who said I'd never be good enough. But hearing that it inspired someone to keep going felt like everything I'd endured had finally found its purpose. Later that night, Daniel hugged me and said, "You've turned pain into a blueprint." I laughed softly. "I just planted seeds." He smiled. And they grew. We began traveling more, visiting small towns and speaking at community centers. Everywhere I went, women shared stories that mirrored mine. Cruel in-laws, cold families, dismissive bosses. I realized Evelyn wasn't just one woman. She was a reflection of every person who tried to shrink another. That thought used to anger me. Now, it fueled me. One evening, after returning from a trip, I walked into my shop and smelled something new. Jasmine, my mother's favorite. My assistant had placed a bouquet on the counter with a note. "You inspire us every day." I stood there, tears in my eyes, realizing how far I'd come from that girl who once begged for space in someone else's world. I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. I had built my own garden, and everyone was welcome to bloom in it. Years later, I found myself writing a memoir. Not to boast, but to leave a map behind for anyone standing where I once stood, in the shadow of someone else's power. The pages came easily, each one lined with lessons carved from pain and patience. I wrote about my mother, about love, about Evelyn. But when I reached the chapter where she knelt before me, I paused. That memory had once burned bright with triumph. Now, it only made me ache. I rewrote it differently this time. I didn't describe her fear or my anger. I wrote about what came after, the silence, the reflection, the strange sadness that follows victory. When the book was published, I titled it The Weight of Petals. It became more popular than I ever expected. Women sent letters saying, "Your story is my story." One day, a young girl approached me at a signing, eyes bright. "Do you still think about her?" she asked. I smiled softly. "Sometimes," I said, "but not with hate. With gratitude." She nodded like she understood. That night, I looked at the first copy of my book and ran my fingers over the title. The Weight of Petals, because even beauty carries memory, even peace has roots in pain. Somewhere, I hoped Evelyn would have approved. Maybe if she'd lived longer, she might have written her own story too. One about learning too late what love really means. The day I turned 50, Daniel surprised me with a trip to the coast, the same place where Evelyn had lived her final years. When we arrived, I recognized the path to her old garden. The house had new owners, but the flowers still grew wild and free. I knelt beside the white roses and smiled. "You're still here," I whispered. The ocean wind answered softly, carrying the scent of salt and memories. Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded. More than okay. We spent the afternoon walking along the beach, collecting shells. The sky burned gold as the sun dipped low, and I thought about how much life had changed. Every struggle, every wound, had led me here, to peace, to love, to self-respect. Before we left, I planted a small sprig of lavender near the roses. "For her," I said quietly. Daniel smiled. "She'd like that." As we drove home, I felt lighter, as if I'd finally put the story to rest. That night, I dreamed of Evelyn, not as the cruel woman I met years ago, but as the one who tended her garden by the sea. She looked at me, smiling, and said, "You were always good enough, Lila." I woke up with tears in my eyes but no pain in my chest. I realized then that every story has two endings, the one we live and the one we choose to remember. I chose peace. When we returned home from the coast, something inside me shifted. I felt as though Evelyn's ghost had finally rested. I no longer dreamed of the past. I dreamed of gardens, endless, sunlit, filled with people laughing. Maybe that was what healing truly looked like. Color returning after years of gray. A few weeks later, Daniel suggested we open a training school for florists through the foundation. "You've taught so many women to believe in themselves," he said. "Now teach them the craft." The idea lit something in me. Within months, the Lila Grace Academy opened above my main shop. We offered classes in floral design, small business planning, and confidence building. I taught the first session myself. As I spoke to the group of women sitting before me, different ages, different stories, I saw pieces of my younger self in each of them. "You don't need permission to bloom," I told them. "You already have roots." They applauded softly, some with tears in their eyes. After class, a student named June stayed behind. "Did someone ever tell you that you couldn't do this?" she asked. I smiled. "Yes," I said. "But she also taught me how to prove her wrong." June grinned. "Then I'll prove someone wrong too." Watching her walk out the door, I realized Evelyn's cruelty had become fuel for generations of courage. Later that night, Daniel and I stood on our balcony, city lights flickering below. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "Maybe she already is," I replied. And for once, I didn't mean it as forgiveness or defiance. I meant it as truth. The academy flourished. We hosted workshops every weekend, and women traveled from different states to attend. Reporters came again, writing about the florist who planted empowerment. Each article reminded me that stories outlive the people who start them. One afternoon, as I packed roses for a wedding, I found an old notebook tucked behind my counter. It was Evelyn's, her handwriting elegant and sharp. I must have kept it after collecting her evidence years ago. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were notes from her later years. Learn patience. Apologize again. Be kind to Lila. My throat tightened. She had tried, even after everything. I closed the notebook gently and placed it in the Academy's library. On its first page, I wrote, "For every woman who learns too late but still chooses to change." That evening, I held Daniel close. "She really did try," I whispered. He nodded. "People aren't all good or bad, Lila. They're just learning." His words stayed with me. That night, I dreamed of Evelyn again, standing in her garden, smiling but silent. When I woke, I realized the silence wasn't haunting anymore. It was peaceful. Maybe her soul had been waiting for me to see that side of her. I looked out my window at the sunrise spilling gold across the flowers and whispered, "Rest easy." We both did our best. Years passed, and the academy became a cornerstone of the foundation. I watched my students grow. Some opened businesses, others taught classes of their own. It felt like a living legacy. Daniel retired early to help me run things, and our days were filled with laughter and purpose. One afternoon, as we prepared for a new semester, a young journalist visited to film a documentary. She asked if we could visit the shop where it all began. I agreed. When we walked inside, the memories hit me like sunlight through dust. The same counter, the same scent of lavender. I could almost see Evelyn standing there the night she begged for mercy. The journalist asked, "Is it true she knelt before you?" I paused, thinking. "Yes," I said. But what mattered wasn't that she knelt. It's that she stood back up a better person. The woman smiled. "That's rare, Grace." I nodded. "That's the only kind worth having." After filming, Daniel squeezed my hand. "You handled that perfectly." "It's easy now," I said. "The pain doesn't live here anymore." We drove home in silence, the kind that feels full instead of empty. That night, I wrote a letter addressed to Evelyn and tucked it inside her notebook at the academy. "You were wrong about me, but you helped me find myself. Thank you." It felt like closing the final page of a long, heavy book. When I turned 60, the foundation threw a celebration in my honor. The hall glittered with white roses, lilies, and candles, flowers Evelyn once called too humble. Hundreds of women I'd mentored attended, each carrying a single bloom. As I stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. I looked out and saw not just faces, but stories, women who had survived, rebuilt, and thrived. I spoke simply. Once, someone told me I'd never be good enough. But she was wrong. I was strong enough. The room went still, and then tears and smiles spread like light. Afterward, a little girl approached me, no more than 10. "My mom says you helped her open her bakery," she said shyly. "I want to be brave like you." I knelt so we were eye to eye. "Then you already are," I said. Her smile warmed me deeper than any award. Later, Daniel raised a toast. "To my wife," he said proudly. "The woman who turned pain into petals." Everyone clapped, but I looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "To Evelyn too." Because without her, none of this would exist. That night, when the hall emptied, I walked among the leftover flowers and felt their fragrance wrap around me. Life had started with cruelty but ended in beauty. And that, I thought, was the best kind of victory. A few weeks after the celebration, I visited the coast again, alone this time. The sea was calm, the air soft with salt and memory. Evelyn's garden still bloomed, tended by the new owners who kindly allowed visitors. I knelt beside the white roses and touched the soil. I kept my promise, I whispered. I built something that lasts. The wind lifted gently, almost like an answer. I closed my eyes and remembered everything. The first insult, the battles, the fear, the night she begged. None of it hurt anymore. It felt distant, like an old photograph fading at the edges. I left a single flower behind, a pink camellia, a symbol of gratitude. As I walked back toward the car, I felt light, almost weightless. On the drive home, I realized how full circle life had become. The woman who once saw me as a threat had become my greatest teacher. The girl who once doubted herself had become her own kind of queen. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Peace doesn't come when the world finally treats you kindly. It comes when you decide to stop proving yourself." I placed the journal beside Evelyn's old notebook, side by side. Two stories intertwined forever. One written in cruelty, the other in courage. And together they made something beautiful. A few months after my visit to the coast, I began writing again. This time, not a memoir, but letters to the women who had inspired me. Some I knew personally. Others had written to me through the foundation. I wanted them to understand that strength wasn't a gift I'd been born with. It was something I had to fight for, piece by piece. In one letter, I wrote, "You will meet people who try to shrink you. Don't fight them with anger. Fight them by growing bigger." That line became something of a motto at the academy. Students printed it on notebooks, posters, even mugs. Daniel teased that I was becoming a brand, but I didn't care. It wasn't fame I wanted. It was legacy. One evening, as I locked the shop, an elderly woman entered. She introduced herself as Marcy, Evelyn's former assistant. I hadn't seen her in years. "I've been meaning to find you," she said. "Evelyn left a letter for you with me before she passed. I never had the courage to deliver it until now." My heart raced as she handed me a small sealed envelope. After she left, I sat alone and opened it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Lila, I've spent my life trying to control everything. You taught me that real strength is surrender. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have. You gave me a chance to see who I truly was. I hope one day you'll remember me kindly." I read it twice, tears sliding down my cheeks. For years, I'd carried pieces of her shadow. That night, I finally let them go. I whispered into the quiet, "I already do, Evelyn. I already do." The years that followed were golden. Daniel and I grew older together, our hair graying, our laughter softer but no less warm. My shop and academy thrived under younger hands. I stepped back from daily work, spending mornings in my garden at home, flowers of every color bursting in sunlight. Sometimes, former students visited, bringing their families, telling me how the foundation changed their lives. Each story was like another blossom in a garden I'd planted long ago. One afternoon, I found Daniel sitting under the cherry tree, watching me with that same look he'd had since we were young. Love, quiet and complete. "You're thinking again," he said. "Always," I laughed. "About her?" he asked. I smiled. "Maybe. But not the way I used to." He nodded knowingly. "You've both found peace." We sat there in silence, birds singing above us, and I realized he was right. Evelyn had once been the storm in my life. Now she was only the wind, still present, but gentle, part of the rhythm. That evening, I picked a white rose from my garden and placed it in a vase beside her old letter. It felt right, like a conversation finally ending. The next morning, I watched the sunrise and thought, if forgiveness is the final chapter, maybe love is the epilogue. One autumn morning, I returned to the shop for an anniversary celebration. The place was full of life, customers chatting, students arranging bouquets, music playing softly. My first employee, Harper, now ran the business. She hugged me tightly and said, "You built this world, Lila." I smiled. "No, we built it together." The mayor attended, unveiling a plaque that read, "In honor of Lila Grace Parker, whose flowers taught a city to bloom." The crowd clapped, and I felt something inside me settle. Later, as the music quieted, I took a moment alone near the window. The sunlight hit the rows of flowers, roses, daisies, lilies, and I remembered my very first day behind that counter, trembling, terrified, and hopeful. That young woman had no idea what waited ahead: betrayal, pain, justice, redemption. But she survived it all. And as I looked around at the faces of women who had followed their own paths to strength, I felt certain Evelyn's story had been worth telling. She'd been wrong about me, but maybe she had been right about one thing. Daniel deserved someone strong. He had found her. And she had found herself. When the event ended, Harper handed me a bouquet of white and lavender roses. "For you," she said. I inhaled their scent and smiled. "For all of us," I replied. In the twilight of my life, the world seemed softer. The storms had passed, the wounds healed. I spent my evenings writing short reflections, lessons I wanted to leave behind. I wrote about love and loss, kindness and courage. But mostly, I wrote about forgiveness. One night, Daniel sat beside me on the porch, his hand resting over mine. "You've lived so much," he said. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought about that for a long time. "No," I said finally. "If not for her, I wouldn't be who I am." He nodded. "Then maybe she was part of the plan." I smiled. "Maybe." The stars blinked above us, steady and ancient. I leaned against his shoulder and closed my eyes, feeling peace wrap around me like a soft blanket. I knew then that my story had finally found its ending, not in revenge or triumph, but in balance. I whispered, "Good night, Evelyn," to the night air, half expecting the wind to answer. And maybe it did, because a single petal from the rose bush drifted across my lap, landing gently, like a final goodbye. Now, when I water the flowers each morning, I think about everything that has bloomed from one cruel sentence spoken years ago. "You'll never be good enough." Those words used to haunt me. Now they make me smile. They were the spark that ignited the life I built. I see it all. The shy girl who opened a small shop, the woman who fought for her marriage, the battle that turned into mercy, and the legacy that grew from both. Evelyn's name still appears on charity walls and scholarships. I made sure of that. She may have started as my enemy, but she became part of the story that saved me. Sometimes, I imagine her walking beside me in the garden, elegant as ever, teasing, "You really made me kneel, didn't you?" And I'd laugh and say, "Yes, but I also let you stand." That's the truth I want remembered. Power without mercy destroys, but mercy without strength fades. The balance is what makes us human. As I lock up the shop for the last time before retirement, I whisper to the flowers, "We did it." The sun filters through the window, turning every petal to gold. The woman who once called me a nobody had been wrong. I wasn't, never good enough. I was the only one strong enough to make her kneel, and kind enough to forgive her when she did. Please follow.